All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar today. As you can see on the screen, it's titled Cybersecurity in the Boardroom, How to Effectively Report to the Board. My name is Scott Raspin. I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing here at TDI, one of the longest standing cybersecurity firms, and also the creators of our CNSite platform. It's our cyber risk effectiveness and performance management platform. And so most of you are aware board members are becoming more curious and involved when it comes to cybersecurity, yet security teams can tend to struggle when reporting to the board how well their cyber program is doing. And so this webinar, it's a panel style webinar, and it's going to discuss kind of challenges boards face understanding cyber risk, question board members should be asking, the metrics and the KPIs that matter most, and really so much more. And so today we're joined by Byron Davis. He is the moderator of this event. Byron is the CISO of UT Southwestern Medical Center, where he leads technology risk in cybersecurity. And prior to working at UT Southwestern, he's held various IT and security roles at Farmers Brothers, a public food service company, as well as State Farm, where he led enterprise-wide detection and monitoring of cybersecurity threats. And then before working in the private sector, he worked for 17 years in the U.S. intelligence community for agencies such as the CIA, DoD, Department of Energy, et cetera. And so Brian is joined today by three of our panelists, and they are Deborah Dunny, who is an independent board director, executive consultant, and C-suite executive working with both publicly traded and private companies. She has tremendous knowledge of technology, digital transformation, enterprise risk, cybersecurity, and governance to the boardroom, and really so much more. Deborah is a National Association of Corporate Directors, or NACD, Board Leadership Fellow, and she's also the former Executive Vice President and CTO at CACI, and she's also held leadership roles within the DoD, where she was awarded the Secretary of Defense Medal for Meritorious Civilian Service. Next is Brian Galloway, who is the Director of Information Security for Enphase Energy, a publicly traded energy technology company based out of California. Brian has security and risk accountability for global IT, as well as product digital services security. He's got 20 plus years of IT and InfoSec experience. And prior to joining Enphase Energy, he held various IT and security roles with Sunoco Products Company, Booz Allen Hamilton, Equifax, and others. And then last but certainly not least is Tony Cole, who is the CTO of Ativo Networks and a board member and advisor for multiple companies. He's also on the board of directors for the ISC Squared. And Tony has over 35 years of experience. And prior to Ativo Networks, he held executive positions at FireEye, McAfee, and Symantec. He's also a member of the NASA Advisory Council, and he was the Government Computer News' 2014 Industry IT Executive of the Year. Now, before I turn it over to Byron, just a few housekeeping items. First, if you have any questions throughout this discussion, there's a little Q&A button that you see in your Zoom window. Feel free to type those questions in to that Q&A window, and we'll address questions. We'll spend some time at the end of the discussion answering some of those questions that arise. And then last, this event is being recorded, and we will send the link out to everyone in the next few days after we've had a chance to kind of edit it and publish it online. We'll make sure that we get the link to this recording over to you. So with that being said, I'd like to pass it over to Byron.
Great. Thanks so much, Scott, and really appreciate the kind introductions to our esteemed panelists as well as to myself. I'm excited about this conversation around cybersecurity in the boardroom. I think it's something that certainly information security teams struggle with in terms of how to present, but then also board members at times struggle with how do they really understand cyber risk in their organizations. To set the stage for this conversation, I'm interested in hearing first from the panelists' perspectives on the key drivers that have really moved cybersecurity from a topic discussed only in the IT department all the way to the boardroom across various industries. So, Tony, let's start with you. How did we get here?
Yeah, it's fascinating when you look back over the history of attacks that have taken place, and as they become more and more mainstream, and more and more publicity around those. And it's quite often it's self-explanatory, at least in the last 4 or 5 years, where we see ransomware kick up, where it's had significant impact and shut down systems, for publicly facing companies. As well as some of the very impactful attacks against government entities, school districts, cities, and many others, where it's shut down operations for consumers, for students, for teachers, and for many others. I think one of the reasons we're having this conversation today is quite frankly, is the impact it's had, to publicly traded companies, where we've seen stock prices drop. We've seen significant impact to operations where things have shut down. Colonial, pipeline is a great example. Solar Wind supply chain attack is a great example. I think many of those have really ratcheted up, the exposure to boards, as well as the possibility of, and some are underway already, but lawsuits against these companies, against boards. So are they doing their due diligence to ensure that the companies were doing all the right things, to counter these attacks? So I think that that's one of the reasons we're sitting where we are today.
Thanks, Tony. Brian, do you have different perspectives on that?
I certainly don't have different. I agree with the publicity being a primary driver. That's certainly where these conversations have started and kicked off from. I've seen from both inside and outside of organizations that along with that publicity and that awareness comes, that starts the conversation. And then what I think boards and executive leadership teams start to realize is they've got a lot invested in this technology. So we've seen automation, digitization, we've seen this shift to cloud adoption and SaaS, and that's happened over the last 5-10 years. And when you get that type of momentum happening quickly, you get adoption without necessarily understanding what you're depending on and how much risk there actually is your organization. So along with the awareness that comes with the publicity, there's this realization that there's a lot more from a business perspective riding on the potential impacts of this. So along with the reputation, along with the customer churn, the management time, cleanup costs, now we're talking about real operational impact. And I think all of those are driving more of this conversation to really understand what the risk looks like and why what position we're really in and why we're there.
Great, thanks, Brian. And Deb, do you have thoughts there?
Hey, everybody out there. Can you hear me okay?
We can, loud and clear.
Just checking. Okay, thanks. So what I would tell you is that besides all of what we're reading in the newspapers and what we as security professionals are well aware is happening in these enterprise environments, there also has been notice from the oversight requirements standpoint coming out of both the SEC and other organizations that follow SEC requirements. So basically, if you're a publicly traded board, you are subject to SEC audit, and they have elevated that your independent auditor also is required to report a whole bunch of things tied in with cyber breaches. And then you also have other organizations where they've imposed an awful lot of requirements for critical infrastructure and the like that have to be reported as a compliance standpoint back into the government. So when you have these things happening and it shows up in your proxies as questions or things that are happening that are not even what I would refer to as material per se, but they're still required to be reported. And you add on that every one of the US states have separate laws about personally identifiable information and the requirements and the timelines for when you have to disclose that something happened related to that, and the need for some really expert lawyers to help you through that process. That, basically it's not just that it's suddenly showing up, it's a requirement, a major oversight requirement across the board.
Fantastic. And Deb, since I have you here, what are some of the main challenges that you're seeing board members facing in understanding cybersecurity risk?
So NACD publishes a cyber governance handbook that's the National Association of Corporate Directors, and does support both private and public companies and not-for-profits. But I hear a lot from different companies, two things specifically. One that the boards don't understand what management's talking about when you come forward with a set of initiatives, like, well, we need to roll out multi-factor authentication, or we need to roll out whatever it is. And, you know, there's a bunch of folks in the boardroom that are kind of like bobbing their head, but they don't understand the impact of what that particular expenditure is going to do for them. So we really need to change the dialogue for our board members to explain things in very plain English that, you know, X, Y, and Z are tied to our ability to do a requirement, you know, a compliance requirement. These things we're doing because it's aligned with our strategy. And in order to enable our business strategy, we need to put these things in place to be, you know, secure in doing that. So that's one area, is that management board conversation is really challenging, especially around measures and metrics. And some have been kind of comic, like folks coming forward with metrics like, ooh, we blocked, you know, 3 million hits this week. You know, it's like, I don't really care what you blocked. I want to know what got through, you know, so we're educating. But then, you know, there's still an awful lot about knowing just how much is enough, because, you know, the more you spend doesn't necessarily mean that you're really not going to be vulnerable. You'll always be vulnerable. So that, you know, that's a big challenge of deciding what to prioritize and how to approach it.
Thank you. Tony, what do you see as some of the main obstacles or challenges that board members face?
I would say first, I agree with everything that Deb just stated. And I would state that, you know, many of them don't understand the technical acumen or lack of technical acumen, you know, for the board members themselves. So don't be too deep technically. You know, as Deb said, explain, you know, it a high level term, the impact that something you're, you know, asking to do, you know, could provide as a benefit to the organization. Some of the better CISOs that I've seen in the past have gone through when they've been new in an organization, and they've built a journey. They've done their 90 days, they've done their analysis, and they've created a journey. You know, here's where we're at today, and here's where I want to take the organization to. So, and then build that map at a very high level and explain that to the board, that here are the investments we're looking for. Obviously, after you got your C-level buy-in before you take it to the board, but explain across the board. You know, I would give us today a D. By, you know, the end of a 3-year period, I hope to have us at a B+ with this level of investment. And here's how it's going to impact the organization, where we're going to mitigate risk in these specific areas. And though, of course, not exuding too much overconfidence, just explaining, you know, where it's going to take you and how it's going to help the organization. And I think those are some of the best things you can do to bring the board along that journey with you, so they understand where you're at and where you're going.
Thanks, Tony. So, Brian, for you, what questions do you think board members should be asking to better understand cyber risk?
So, yeah, to build exactly off where Tony just left us in that conversation of understanding the narrative first, you know, as an extension of what questions they should be asking. We start with first, you know, making sure that they have a clear understanding of the taxonomy, the terminology being used, the concepts being presented. If the board isn't sure what's being said, members need to ask, and that's a two-way street, right? Not only does the CISO and the rest of the executive team, that the business need to bring a clear narrative and a clear structure that aligns to the business. You know, I hope and I expect that board members are open about their level of understanding. It's hard. You know, I think that's why we have conversations like this. Cyber is not a standard business risk. You can't assign a simple dollar value to an operational downtime impact like you could in a manufacturing organization and say this is a quantifiable risk that we can then address. Cyber tends to be more ephemeral, right? And the risk is changing. So, you know, board members starting with an understanding of the risk that they face. So whether, you know, as Deb mentioned earlier, whether it's, you know, legal and regulatory, whether it's understanding the threat model that the organization is working with, and how those translate into business risk, not cyber risk necessarily, but business risk, because there's always an impact to these things. That's what we care about. That's what we're trying to solve, is the business level risk. So from the board, start asking the questions around, you know, I understand that we have initiatives, we're doing things. What does that mean to the business? What are we protecting? What are we enabling? Why is that relevant to us in our industry, into our particular operating environment and our footprint? Those are useful questions that help both sides better understand how to meet together and have a clear vision of where you're trying to get to on that roadmap, as Tony mentioned.
Thanks. And Deb, do you have thoughts on this? I know that you have lots of board experience. What questions have you seen asked that really gets to the heart of cyber risk?
Well, there's a bunch of, besides what everybody just said, which is so important as far as what are we required to do from a compliance standpoint, recognizing that compliance isn't adequate. I think that we need to try to drive a conversation about risk tolerance and risk appetite into board decisions around anything they're doing. If you're doing an acquisition per se, or you're doing some sort of merger, or you're doing some sort of a new development, whatever it may be, it's important to not have the security conversation as an afterthought. It needs to be embedded right there at the get-go to help calibrate and, give you some great examples of that. Verizon bought AOL, which they later spun back out, but they bought AOL, and they disclosed major cyber activities for AOL before that deal even closed, which dramatically changed the buying price. And then they still didn't really get to resolution on all the things that had taken place even afterwards. So knowing that information up front, they might not have gone forward with it to begin with. I don't know if they would or not, but just saying it needs to be a strategic decision about how much are you willing to tolerate, exfiltration of our intellectual, property, or how much are you willing to, worry about your operational technology as opposed to just your, information technology, recognizing that both are part of a strategic enterprise cyber strategy, and they're often not managed together. So, you might hear about the IT piece within the, from the CIO or whoever's briefing the board, but you often don't hear about how that connects with, the potential kinetic things that can happen with operational technology managed separately.
So you raise a good point around establishing risk tolerance. That's a challenge for many teams. How have you seen effectively organizations understand their own risk tolerance? Not
well. I think that folks in general are really challenged with having the conversation from the get-go. So you kind of have to tease it out of folks and first give them some understanding of, what your enterprise risk is, right? I mean, if you're an internet-facing company, or, you have client-facing activities that's, millions of people, clearly it's very high risk. And it's something that you probably want a board member that knows something about cyber on the board. If you're doing something a little more niche-y in a production environment, you may not have a whole lot of exposure. And, getting folks to talk about the business priorities as a starting point, and then, teasing out of them, well, what if this were to happen? How is that going to impact your top line priority? Just keep driving it back to the, the strategy of the corporate growth.
Thanks for that. I want to kind of drill down into this next question and like each of your perspectives on it. Are there examples you can give us on how CISOs have effectively communicated cyber risks to the board, or conversely, what not to do? Tony, let's start with you.
Yeah, I have, and I'll go back to my my earlier comments, and that's really understanding, your environment and understanding it well as a new CISO coming in. So, in understanding, what your business does, as Deb just mentioned. So understanding all the different business units and building relationships across all of those business units. You really can't understand risk management and risk tolerance for your business unless you understand, the cogs in the business that are driving revenue, or what's important to the business. So you really have to build the relationships across the board. Across the organization, as well as, with that board, if you're allowed to in the role that you have. So I think that's one of the most important pieces. But then, as I stated, building a journey out and explaining that to all of the other business unit owners across the organization as well, so that everybody is on board with you. I keep using the wrong analogy there, on the bus with you, to take that journey with you as you try to make everything better. And I'll give you a great example. When you look at Active Directory. That's a great example for me where there's a tremendous amount of effort that's needed around that to keep it secure. And yet more often than not, in many organizations, the CISO has nothing to do with it and the CIO thinks of it as plumbing. That's an issue. So what you need to do is you need to have those conversations and build those relationships so everybody understands the risk, and then you can move together, even if you don't own it, by explaining that risk to take that journey together. In doing so, that will help you really build the case and that journey so you can have that discussion with your board as well. And it's really important to understand the acumen of the board as well, because quite frankly, a lot of publicly traded companies, you may not have anybody on the board that truly understands cybersecurity, because many of them probably won't even understand IT. I think a great example of that is, you'll see CISOs, in a bad example, that will state, do a presentation to the board and then walk away based on a couple of questions they had and think everything's absolutely fine. I'm not a physicist, but I could ask, questions for a physicist all day long. It doesn't mean I understand the answers. So, and I think that's a really important thing, when you leave that boardroom. So do the board members understand, what you presented to them? And when they asked a question and you responded, did they understand the answers? And I'm not demeaning those like Deb that really do understand it, but there's a lot of others that don't get it yet. It's a lot of efforts underway to fix that problem. But I think it's really important to understand the technical acumen of the board members so that you can have that relationship with them in a conversation. What they comprehended and what they didn't.
Brian, how about you? Do you have examples of what's worked well and what has not?
I do. I have a few stories. I won't say whether they're mine or someone else's, but I can tell you that a couple of them were very painful, and some of them worked much better. So as I mentioned earlier, Tony's concept of establishing the journey, establishing the ultimate goals and the path to get there is important to building these reporting narratives. And as Deb said, having good and bad, there are bad metrics out there, certainly for the wrong audience. And I've been a part of discussions where exactly what Deb mentioned, where bad metrics came up, where someone came in and said, here's all the events we've collected in our SIM in the last month, right? Here's all the findings or the triggers we had on our EPP. So these are signature triggers. That means nothing to anybody. And frankly, it doesn't have a business relevance because it's not tied to a business relevant risk or an outcome we want to see. So along with that journey, at some point along the way, someone convinced the board or the executive committee to invest in a solution that helped provide that metric, right? Invest in a SIM tool, invest in an endpoint protection or EDR solution. So what I've found to be more effective and what I try to do is take that journey and break it down into individual narratives that help justify those concepts we're trying to pass along. So what you can work on after you get the initial education, after you get that taxonomy, that conversation going, is concepts that the board and these types of folks can recognize because it means something to the business. So if we talk about something happening on an individual device and having what we would call an EPP or EDR solution, but having edge protection that real time stops bad things from happening versus having it come back to human to have to analyze, they can understand response time, need time to respond, right? They can understand that that's a bigger potential impact. That's more time for bad things to happen. So you can create a narrative that becomes business relevant when talking about specific goals and objectives that tie into the larger narrative, but those are tied into the larger journey. But those individual narratives, the three things that I tend to focus on and I encourage is simple, focused and concrete in metrics, and be credible with it. So make sure you're prepared to have the discussion in a way that the board can understand. So don't talk like a robot. Don't talk like you're talking to your ops team, or you're talking to your VM team. Talk to someone who you have to assume has no idea what you're talking about. So it has to be common language, ideally business language, and that ultimately gets in my experience, we talk about how to communicate risk effectively. It has to be business relevant. Otherwise, you're just spewing numbers in terms that no one really has a concept for.
Those are great thoughts. One of my observations as it ties to metrics is that a lot of information security teams really face the challenge of manually compiling all these metrics. You mentioned from the SIM or from an endpoint solution. And basically they struggle to effectively quantify or qualify that risk. So what are some of the metrics or KPIs, Deb, that you like to see when discussing cyber risk?
Well, there's a whole slurry of metrics, of course. I think the first thing is if the folks have done a really good job of articulating what their critical data is, from the get-go. So, kind of what the family jewels are that you're trying to protect more so than you're protecting all the other data, either because of compliance or because it's, good for your business. Then you start to look at, the extent to which those are in authoritative systems. Are they, replicated all over the place, or, like really what the pedigree of that data might be to make sure that it's not being tampered with. You start to look at all the metrics tied to the frameworks like NIST and other ones that we use for the board level metrics. The progress that we're making towards, moving up the food chain against our peer groups for the things tied in with those specific framework elements. And everybody has different frameworks. A lot of folks use NIST, but, certainly some of the independent, consulting companies have their own frameworks too. There's a whole bunch of them. So the thing there is to really look at, the different elements of, detect, defend, prevent, recover, and how that plays out. I think that there's a whole slurry of specific elements underneath there that will tie well to a set of initiatives. And from a board perspective, they're not so interested in the technology. They're interested to know if you're going to spend X amount of money and you're going to do it in X amount of time, against a schedule. Are you on track, for what you're trying to accomplish and roll out in the time frame you say that you're going to do it? So that's really where you put most of your emphasis. I agree, though, that a very large preponderance of the metrics about the health of the current infrastructure can be automatically rolled up and displayed for folks. But that's really, in some ways, more for the detailed layers, more for the management team. You can take all of that, though, and bring it up a layer higher to a little, stoplight chart or something that just says, that the enterprise, we're red, we're green, we're blue, where we are on specific areas that you care about, especially when you're rolling out, new capabilities and new technologies and how that plays in together. So, without getting into specifics, there's lots and lots of metrics. If you're DoD compliant, you probably are responding to about 900 that you have to respond to from a compliance standpoint. So I assure no board ever wants to see that. They just want to know, are we compliant? Yeah, 80%. We had these major discrepancies and these minors, and we're fixing them.
Good. Well, Tony, what do you see as some of the reporting tools or automation that can be used beyond, your typical spreadsheet or PowerPoint to better communicate cyber risk?
There's a lot of cool dashboards now that are being created that can really help you explain, and I go back to that same theme, it can help you explain the journey. So you've got an investment, for instance, and I'll use that as an example that you brief the board on, in their, Q1 board meeting, and, here you are, it's Q2 in the following fiscal year, and you're giving an update to the board, on where you're at. You've got that investment, you bought the products that you want, and, maybe you're using one of these automated dashboards to show that, by the way, around our high value assets in these different divisions of the company, we're at 72% of our rollout for EDR technology. So, and, we've got network segmentation up around these high value assets as, another component. And, our vulnerability management, proficiency now is up to 92% around our high value assets inside these divisions. So not diving too deep as Deb stated, because I think that's really important, but putting in language that the board can understand, and in language that's important to them, because then they start to see, all right, that high value asset they know is a driver of revenue for the company. And here's the money we gave this CISO, and here's what they're doing that money, and here's how they're taking us down that journey. And I think all of that while still pushing, in that conversation, the assumption of breach mentality. So the board understands No solution is perfect. No matter what you do, don't raise the level of confidence to that 100% because everyone will get breached, and you're building the best structure you can to mitigate the impact from a potential breach.
And Brian, do you have thoughts on how reporting should be handled to the board?
I have found that I think as Tony mentioned, there's a lot of good dashboarding tools out there now. If you don't have anything and you have the ability to invest, it gets you a leg up to buy a tool that either allows you to input data and provide, a letter score or some sort of a stoplight chart. Some of those even have, industry intelligence that gives you, as Deb was mentioning, the comparison against your peer group. I have found that as I've become more, as I have programs who get more mature and we get more sophisticated in our board understanding, or as we want to prepare that journey and talk about those narratives in more tailored ways, I've worked with my teams to build our own dashboards. We've automated that in a way that directly supports our narrative so that we can talk to the board about specifically certain products or services that we have, certain enclaves or data sets or things that we want to protect, certain areas of our operations that are important to us. It allows us to highlight and really control at a fine-grained level the impact of these investments that we want to have. So if I come in and say I want to invest in a specific technology, I can call directly to that narrative to say, here's where this is going to move the risk needle. Here's the expectation, the timeline, the investment it's going to take, the value to the business, and show that in a way that is consistent over time. Part of the trick here is finding a narrative you can stick to over time. What you don't want to do is move the cheese on the board to where every time you bring something into them, you're showing them a different paradigm. So, while the board doesn't want to see, an attack matrix model that again kind of says, here's all the initial ingress that we stopped, and here's a tool where it fits into this. That's more of a management or an operational view. You also want to get to something you can grow with and establish. So back to what Tony said about that journey, establish that 3-year, 5-year plan, but give yourself a framework you can grow into and show risk and improvement.
Byron, if I could add to that comment from Brian, because I like the way he laid it out. I remember a CISO I used to work with that was phenomenal, and he would go into each board meeting, when he briefed every other board meeting, and he would give himself a grade, and then would do a stoplight, structure behind that, showing why he had the grade he did, where they were at and how they were making that thing, move up. So it was part of that journey. But the first thing he did was give himself a grade, and he would give his team all of the credit, but the grade was always his, and he would tie into that, world events, new vulnerabilities, how they related to, a 0-day that came out. So, but put it in plain language as part of his dashboard to show them down that path, how they were moving. So it's a very interesting way to do it. And I think some of these automated dashboards can really help with that.
Well, certainly, I think, when you lay out an approach like that, that becomes very complex very quickly. And so I see that there's really the need for automation in order to be able to drive that. Deb, what have you seen that's been used effectively, either from an automation standpoint or from a reporting standpoint?
Right. So there are a number of tools that are out there, or a handful of them, that I think are helping. And a lot of folks do build their own, which is good. I think having a dashboard is excellent. You don't always, depending on how the board is structured, you may not be briefing the whole board at every board meeting, but you may be briefing a committee at every board meeting. Once a year, best practice is to brief the entire board to limit liability and the like. But I just want to address something slightly different related to how it's being presented. I have found that doing some exercises with the board included around crisis management is a really key thing for the board to kind of grasp what's going on. And then when they look at that, kind of stoplight chart, or however you want to do your scorecard, even if it's sitting in the appendix, they'll have a little more appreciation for what that means. Now, that being said, those exercises need to be relevant to the business that you're in. It's fun to take down the water tower, but don't do that if, that's not the business that you're in. But I would say that, including the board, because in a crisis, as we all know, there's tremendous amount of external pressure, internal pressure for communications, and having good relations with, PR companies, pre-templating, who's responsible for speaking to the company, to the government and the public and whatever it is not the board. It is going to be somebody designated within the management team to do that, who's, kind of running an ops center or whatever it is. And it's really important because you can lose tremendous credibility with your constituencies by passing out the wrong information or having partial information and confusing the narrative. So, I think that in addition to looking at the technical metrics that you want to kind of bring forward as to how well the environment's doing, it's important to also bring forward some organizational alignment of how cyber lives within the company, who's accountable for what, who's responsible to elevate when something happens and to what level and what thresholds. So does it go to a committee within the company? At what point do you notify the board? Although I'll tell you, if something goes public, you better notify your board. Worst thing you can do is hear about it from the public before you're told internally. And then make sure that everybody knows who's on point to speak for the company and to remediate whatever's taken place. And there's so many things tied into that. So I would include that process or flow diagram or whatever you want it to be, in addition to some of the other metrics that you're talking about, how well you're doing at protecting things.
Thanks very much.
And Byron, if I could real quick, just because I know we're right at the end of the time here, and I apologize, but so many good things that Deb just brought up and Tony was leading to that it made me think of something that we've started looking into, which is this tie into the crisis management and this proactive inclusion of the board into some of these activities. We've started looking at ways that we can take some of those headlines. So, recently, earlier this year, when we had just a rash of very significant ransomware attacks, right, on very large and multinational organizations, we started looking at ways that we could take those headlines and provide not only a soothing update to the management, the executive team, and the board, saying, hey, this isn't happening to us, we're monitoring for this, we have these protections in place, but also a follow-up that said, if this type of thing did happen, and Deb said, remind them of, here's the process we would take, here's how long it would take us to know about this, here's when you would be informed, here's who would be letting you know, here's our response pattern. So what I've started working with the team on, my team here, is starting to look at ways that we can be more proactive in that awareness and that consistent reminder of, we are actively monitoring this, we do have this under control, and include the board in those conversations so that they have a confidence that we have not just protections in place, but the ability to respond, to manage those crises, and provide them with information in a timely manner.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate that addition. And it looks like we are running up against time. So Deb, Brian, and Tony, really appreciate your deep insights on this subject. I'm going to pass it back to Scott. It looks like there are a few questions that are in the Q&A chat. Scott, do you want to help us through those?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And thank you all. This is a really great conversation. Really appreciate everybody that's participated in the discussion's been very insightful for me as well. So yeah, a couple of questions before we end this event. Let me see. So here's one. So if you're a CISO trying to navigate this issue, what are some of the biggest pitfalls to avoid when trying to get the board on the same page as the security team? I know we've talked a little bit about this already, but Tony, do you want to maybe take that one?
Yeah, certainly. I think one of the most important things is to, again, understand the technical acumen of the board before you try to get them on the same page, because many of the technical terms that your security team will want to talk about, they may not understand. So to do this, you want to talk about it from a corporate perspective, the risk to the company, the risk to specific, revenue producing assets, to risks of the company, publicity maybe, but you want to talk about it from that perspective so the board understands it, because that's what they think about, on the corporate governance side. What are the steps that they should be doing to do their due diligence as board members? And if your security team is aligned in that fashion and thinking about it from the board perspective, it's much easier to have a conversation than it is for them to talk technically to them, about a specific breach, a specific vulnerability, or the potential of a breach. So it's much better to talk about it from a corporate perspective and risk to the company.
Perfect. And Deb, here's another question. how often do you think boards should be meeting with security teams? Should they be doing it monthly? Should they be doing it yearly? Is that not enough time? Is there kind of a sweet spot for organizations, or just does it vary from organization to organization?
Right. So it will vary from organization to organization based on the type of business that you're in. But I mean, obviously, if you're a train company, you're going to talk to safety and security at every meeting, right? Or an electric company or whatever it may be. I would tell you that I believe that security should be brought up at every board meeting, but it may only get brought up in committee, tied to the specific area that you need to address. But that overarching enterprise scorecard should be at least in an appendix if it's not going to the full board at every meeting. And that also, at least once a year to combat liability, you should be having, a discussion with the board, at least annually if you're kind of a lower risk business. And that seems to be a good benchmark for limiting liability, both to the company and the board against lawsuits, because what you are is subject to, the judgment rule. And if you don't know what that is, that means that, when you get sued, if the judgment rule says that as a board member, you're really responsible only for the information that the corporation shares with you. But if you're not asking the questions, or it's not there for you to see in some context, then you are going to be, potentially subject to gross negligence. And that is one of the only ways that, board members and the like, those suits come through, is really if you're violating, gross negligence, or you're really violating the judgment rule. So I think that it's important to have it in there at every meeting.
Okay, no, that's great. And then I think we have time for maybe one more question. So Brian, if we're talking about reporting and dashboards, can you share maybe some example KPIs that we should be reporting to the board? Can we take these specific KPIs and present them in a way that really conveys the context of those maybe less cybersecurity aware?
Yeah, so some of this is, again, dependent on the sophistication, savviness of your board, understanding how much foundational understanding you've put in place. Really one KPI that can double as a KRI at times that I like is owning when things go sideways. So it's great to say we blocked a bunch of things, as we said. It's great to say we have visibility to a bunch of things. I like, and someone mentioned it earlier, I like reporting if there are incidents, whether they're low level, small impact or large, but I like reporting them in terms of organizational impact and lessons learned. So those are good. KPIs for me is the number of incidents we had. That's typically seen as a KRI for bad things happened. Why did it happen? For me, it's an indicator of gaps that we have, and the only way we're going to know that we have gaps in our security posture is if we're effectively reporting on the things that didn't happen the way we expected them to. And ideally, you have a way to back that up again with a root cause analysis that says, here was the localized impact because we had this defense in depth that other controls caught whatever this failure was, but here's the failures we experienced. So reporting on failures is a good one that I like. And then there's others around levels of preparedness that again somewhat depend on how you've set up your risk model, your risk appetite, and what your board is interested in seeing, whether it's saturation of certain protection mechanisms, whether it's certain more technical things, depending on the industry you're in, the business you're in. Those can take a few different points, but overall, I think operationally a nice one is that incident metric. That's a good one we can all learn from.
Awesome. Well, I think that pretty much comes up right on time for us, and that's going to conclude this discussion today. Really a big thank you to Byron for doing such a fantastic job moderating this discussion. And thank you, Tony, Deb, and Brian for your insightful input. Just really great discussion. We hope everyone enjoyed this discussion. And just as a reminder, we did record this, and I will be sending this link out to everybody that signed up. So keep a lookout in your email and on the TDI and C Insight blog.